The fisherman saw something bobbing in the middle of the ocean 217 kilometers from shore, with no boat in sight and no life jacket. He thought it was driftwood, but as he approached, his heart almost stopped. The dog was exhausted, soaked, and struggling to stay above water, and no one could explain how he got there. However, what happened next defied all expectations and left you speechless. The sea was calm, deceptively calm, the kind of stillness that made seasoned fishermen uneasy, the kind that always preceded a storm. 40 miles off the coast of Florida, 42-year-old Thomas Grady led his when he saw it. He initially thought it was driftwood, just another piece of wreckage carried by the current, but something about the way it moved and fought the tide instead of drifting with it tugging at his gut made him grab his binoculars and focus, and that's when his heart skipped a beat. It was a German Shepherd dog, obviously exhausted, barely keeping his head above the water alone. No land in sight, no boat nearby, nothing. Thomas's stomach tightened, and this wasn't just rare, it was impossible. Thomas cut the engine and yelled over the side, "Hey, hang in there, buddy, I've got you." The dog didn't respond because he was too far gone to react. His eyes glazed with a mixture of terror and fear. He muttered, already throttling the boat in the animal's direction as he approached the reality, which became more terrifying. The dog's legs were still paddling, but slowly and erratically, and his head bobbed with every wave, barely above the surface. He had minutes left, maybe less. Without hesitation, Thomas pulled off his shirt, threw a rope ladder overboard, and dove into the water. It was colder than he had anticipated, and the salt stung his eyes, but he pushed through the waves, keeping his eyes fixed on the shepherd's waning strokes. When he finally got to him, the dog's legs gave out, and his body collapsed into Thomas's arms like dead weight. Thomas held him up with one arm and kicked frantically with the other, dragging the shepherd back toward the boat. Once they arrived at the ladder, Thomas pushed from below, and the dog instinctively clawed his way up, collapsing onto the deck in a trembling heap. Thomas followed, panting heavily, and knelt next to the animal, gently brushing the water from his face. The dog's chest was rising, and his fur was salty and tangled. His paws were raw, his breathing was shallow but steady, and he whispered, "You're alive, you crazy beautiful beast, you're alive." He wrapped the dog in a dry tarp and got a bottle of fresh water, but the shepherd remained motionless. Thomas sat next to him, his heart thumping, soaked, and shaking not from the cold, but from the sheer impossibility of what he had just seen. He asked quietly, "What were you doing out here, boy?" The dog didn't respond, but something flickered deep in those amber eyes. Thomas wrapped the soaked tarp tighter around the German Shepherd and steered the boat toward the closest marina almost 2 hours away. The sun had changed, casting a golden sheen across the waves, but the dog didn't raise his head. Instead, he just lay there shivering every few minutes. Thomas looked over, still breathing and still alive, but the questions wouldn't stop. The shepherd had no collar, no harness, no life vest, no tracker, and nothing but raw skin under his front legs, as if he had been swimming for hours or longer. When the vape reached land, Thomas didn't immediately go to animal control because something inside of him resisted that. Instead, he carried the weak and limp dog into his truck and drove straight to a small vet clinic he knew just outside of Clear. Boats before cruel owners threw them out like trash, but this far out to 17 kilometers from shore was something else entirely. He reached out carefully, placing a hand on the dog's back, and "You got a name, boy?" No response, not even a twitch. The receptionist looked up as he pushed through the door and said, "Sir, you can't just..." He almost drowned 135 miles out, but Thomas interrupted, saying, "No ID, no explanation. I just need someone to look at him." That silenced the room, and a young vet appeared with wide eyes. "You said 135 miles offshore," and Thomas nodded. "I found him swimming alone in a matter of seconds." The dog was taken to the back room, and Thomas sat in the waiting area, dripping seawater and worried. He didn't even know why he felt so attached already. Perhaps it was the way the shepherd hadn't given up when everything in the world told him to have the vet come out 20 minutes later, dehydrated, scraped up, and exhausted beyond belief, but she stopped almost incredulously. His heart was strong, somehow, and he managed to make it. "Thank God, there was no chip added, but we did discover something strange." She gave Thomas a small piece of rusted metal that was tangled in his fur near his neck. It looked like a piece of a broken dog tag. Thomas turned it over, and most of the engraving was gone, but there was still only one letter left, replaced the dog on a folded blanket, and placed a bowl of water close by. The shepherd refused to eat, but his eyes followed Thomas intently. Before going to bed, Thomas sat cross-legged next to him and muttered, "You made it out of something no dog should have survived." The cabin had a single bedroom, peeling paint, and an old dock in the back. The dog blinked slowly, saying, "I don't know how or why, but I promise I'm not letting you go." Thomas woke up the following morning to the sound of claws tapping softly against the wooden floor, and for a moment he thought it was a dream, but when he opened his eyes, he saw he was weak, but he was walking slowly around the cabin, favoring one leg. Thomas sat up and said, "Hey, look at you." The dog didn't wag his tail or react to the voice with the same joy that most dogs do, but he paused, looked at Thomas, and blinked once. Thomas stood, poured a fresh bowl of water, and laid out some cooked chicken. The shepherd sniffed it and started eating, slowly but steadily, for the first time since the rescue. Thomas crouched nearby, watching intently. "You're not just smart," he muttered. "You're trained, I can feel it." The dog had a serene demeanor. He didn't flinch at sudden noises, he didn't beg for food, he didn't bark or whimper, he just watched, calculated like a soldier surveying a new battlefield. Thomas, a former Navy rescue diver, had witnessed that behavior in working dogs before. After breakfast, Thomas stepped onto his dock, and the salty wind swept in from the sea stirred memories. He heard the shepherd's soft footsteps behind him, and he stood next to him, gazing out across the water where he had almost died. "You've seen things," Thomas said without looking at him. Later that day, when the dog didn't move, Thomas called a friend, a retired K9 handler named Mike, who was now employed at a private training facility. "I need you to meet someone," Thomas said. "Something's off, or maybe exactly right, but I think this dog was trained." That afternoon, a tall, sharp-eyed man arrived at the cabin and crouched without saying anything. The shepherd stood motionless, his ears slightly raised but not aggressive, and Mike watched him closely. "Sit," he said calmly. The dog didn't move, lay down, or respond, but then Mike did something subtle with 2 fingers. The dog immediately fell to the ground, tail tucked slightly, palm down, and then lowered them in a little curve. His eyes met Mike Thomas's, and his eyes widened. "What was that?" "Silent signal," Mike responded, "is used in tactical ops. Whoever trained him for something big." Mike stood and looked at Thomas, who looked down at the shepherd, who was now lying motionless, wondering why a trained dog would be 135 miles offshore. "You didn't just rescue a stray, you pulled a working dog out of the ocean," Mike said. He didn't have to, because the next question was even more serious. Who sent him there? And why couldn't Thomas sleep that night? He sat by the window, staring at the dog, who was now sleeping at the foot of his bed. The metal piece and broken tag with the R was on the table, and he picked it up and turned it over again, finding no chip, no ID, and no answers. But now there was something more: a mission, a trail, and the terrifying possibility that this dog had seen something or escaped something that no one was supposed to know. As Thomas reached down to run his hand over the shepherd's back, the dog leaned slightly into the touch for the first time, and his tail moved slightly, not trusting, but beginning with it. 2 days later, the shepherd, now going by the nickname Ranger, had started to regain his strength. He followed Thomas through the cabin, rested close to his feet, and even nudged his hand for more chicken when he thought no one was looking. However, what most disturbed Thomas was the way Ranger reacted to certain sounds: not thunderstorms or fireworks, but helicopters. Every time a helicopter passed overhead, even if it was faint and far away, Ranger froze, dropping his ears, lowering his body, and his eyes, those alert, intelligent eyes, turned hard and sharp. Thomas couldn't get rid of it. He picked up the broken tag again, the metal piece they had. He opened the old laptop in his closet, which he hadn't used since retiring, and reconnected with a secure search database that only military personnel and former contractors had access to. It was risky, but the mystery had been staring at him for days. He typed in a few key filters: German Shepherd, military, K9, no chips, last tactical signals, last known East Coast operations, and what appeared wasn't a public report, but a restricted file. Red flagged Operation Nightmark, Animal Asset Recovery Program. Thomas blinked, having never heard of it. The screen loaded with black background and white text. Asset R7 breed German Shepherd, sex male, assignment offshore reconnaissance handler, classified status decommissioned, presumed lost at sea, date of deactivation 3 days before Thomas found him. Thomas leaned back in his chair in shock, knowing that they knew Ranger was out there and that they had marked him lost, not rescued. He clicked Access Denied, and after digging deeper using a few legacy override codes from his diving operations, he finally gained partial access. There was a black SUV pulled up to the edge of his driveway without plates, and two men in plain clothes stepped out. One of them carried a small device, and the other wore gloves. Thomas heard movement behind him and turned to face the ranger, who was standing in the hallway with his eyes locked on the laptop screen and his ears raised. "You recognize this, don't you?" Thomas whispered, and the dog remained motionless. Thomas then stepped to the window and pulled back the curtain. Thomas drove with one eye on the road and the other on the rearview mirror. The SUV hadn't followed, at least not visibly, but that didn't mean they weren't being tracked. Thomas sat in the passenger seat, alert and tense his ears. Silently, he closed the laptop and backed away. Someone had been watching the database, and now they were here. "Come on, Ranger," he whispered, grabbing his keys, and they slipped out the back door, disappearing into the woods behind the cabin. Thomas's old truck was parked down the trail just in case, swinging at every sound. His body language was one of calculation rather than panic. He was processing the situation like a soldier would. They left the paved road behind and followed an old dirt trail that led to a remote marina that Thomas had used for his diving days. It was barely maintained now, with only a few abandoned docks and one rusty storage shed, but that was the point at which he pulled the truck into the shadows and killed the engine. "We'll stay here tonight," he said softly. The ranger didn't move, but his breathing had slowed, conserving energy. Inside the shed, Thomas laid out blankets and shut the creaky door behind them. The air smelled of salt and old oil. Ranger sniffed every corner before settling in near. "They've seen dogs like you, military trackers, detection K9s, even deep-sea deployment teams, but you're different. You weren't just trained to obey. You were trained to think." The ranger looked up at him. His eyes weren't blank, they were present and aware, and then he did something to Thomas. Thomas sat next to him and finally asked the question that had been bothering him since the file appeared. "What were they using you for, boy?" He didn't expect an answer, but he continued talking. Thomas took Ranger down to the dock at sunrise with a last risky plan. "I'm going to find out who deployed you," he said, tightening the straps on a dry bag. "But they'll be looking for you now, so you'll need to stay hidden." Thomas swallowed hard. "You trust me now," and let out a soft exhale that wasn't quite a sigh, but close that night. Their ears and senses were alert. He paused before saying, "Unless you want out." Ranger tilted his head and said, "You've been through enough. I wouldn't blame you if he vanished into the forest and never turned around." But Ranger moved forward and put himself between Thomas and the dock's edge, blocking Thomas's view. Without saying anything, Ranger looked directly into Thomas's eyes, and Thomas smiled faintly. "All right, partner," he said. They loaded onto a small boat that was hidden behind the pier. Thomas had used it for dives years ago, and it was old but dependable. Looked along the shoreline and saw the black SUV half hidden by trees. He muttered a curse and they had followed the truck. The ranger stood at the front of the boat, wind pushing through his fur and keeping his eyes focused and locked on the shore. Then the SUV's passenger door opened and a figure emerged wearing a black face that was covered by a cap and glasses. He raised the phone and spoke into it, and then the ranger let out a bark, not out of fear, but recognition. Thomas looked at him, knowing that he was there. Handler, no response, just focused pacing. Thomas turned to the boat hard toward the open water, saying, "We're not ready for that yet." Ranger sat down, but he never took his eyes off the disappearing figure. Whether that man was an enemy or a friend, one thing was certain now, and soon the world would be too. The ocean was rougher than expected, and Thomas tightened his hold on the wheel as the small boat pitched over a wave, the engine groaning under the strain. Neither of them had spoken for almost an hour, but the weight between them was heavy. Ranger was no longer just a mystery. He was a piece of something bigger. He killed the engine and let the silence settle. "All right," he muttered, throwing a rope to the rocky shore. "It's time for answers." He opened the dry bag and took out the printed version of the restricted file asset R7. Thomas sat on the boat's bench and read it again. There were no names or locations, just tactical terms, a coded mission summary, and a chilling final entry. Terminated due to a compromise. They had meant to kill him. Dangerous. Thomas pulled into a hidden cove he used during his diving years. The cove was surrounded by jagged cliffs, making it only accessible by water or on foot through miles of overgrown brush. However, Ranger had survived by refusing to drown, not by accident, will, or instinct. Thomas reached into the bag once more. and removed the broken tag they had discovered tangled in Rare's fur. It was still crusted with salt. "Ranger," Thomas whispered, "is that what they called you, or is that what you became?" The dog stared at him, not blankly, not like a pet, but as something more, as a partner. Suddenly, Ranger stood and walked to the bow, his ears going up, not in fear but in awareness. Thomas followed his gaze to a distant, silent black helicopter. "Fast, how did they find us again?" Ranger whined softly, then leaped from the boat and ran toward a cliff crevice where a narrow path wound upward. Without thinking, Thomas followed, and at the top of the trail, they huddled behind a boulder. The helicopter hovered for a moment before descending several hundred meters away, and 4 figures in black gear emerged with helmets, visors, and no insignia. The 5th figure, however, stood out with a weathered face and a composed stance. Ranger froze, and Thomas looked down at him. "You know him, don't you?" The shepherd's tail lowered, and his eyes locked on the man. The man scanned the area, then pulled a small device from his pocket, pressed a button, and a high-pitched pulse that was almost too soft for human ears vibrated in the air. The ranger flinched and staggered backward, whimpering, "Hey, what's happening?" Thomas grabbed his fur to steady him. The ranger shook his head and pawed at his ears, causing confusion. Thomas turned back to the man and the device. "They were trying to override you." The handler raised his hand, pointing directly at the cliff. After a few seconds, 2 armed figures started up the path, and Thomas grabbed Ranger by the harness. "We're leaving now." However, Ranger remained motionless as he looked up at Thomas, who was still reacting to the signal. "Old commands, old bonds," he said. "I know it hurts, Thomas, but you get to choose who you are now, not them." The sound grew louder, and Ranger whimpered once more, trembling violently, before he gave a single, sharp bark that reverberated off the cliffs. He then turned, lunged forward, and started running, not down the trail, but in the direction of the helicopter. "Wait, Ranger," Thomas shouted, but he realized that the ranger wasn't running back to them. Rather, he was running to stop it. Thomas chased after him, his heart racing, and as soon as the 2 armed men turned to stop him, he didn't think twice before lunging into one man's leg and knocking him sideways. The second man reached for a weapon, but Thomas tackled him from behind, sending the weapon clattering to the ground. One man down, the other disarmed, the handler stepped forward, and at last, the voice was familiar, pulling at something deep within him. When Thomas moved between them, the handler looked him over. "You think you can protect him? He's not just a dog. He's a classified tool with loose ends." Thomas raised his voice, saying, "You're making a mistake," and the ranger moved to stand next to him. He growled at his former handler, but it wasn't anger. Rather, it was closure. The helicopter engine sounded, and one of the armed men yelled something incomprehensible, and the group started to back away. As the sun sank below the horizon, Thomas wrapped a towel around Ranger and leaned back against the deck. "You're not R7 anymore," he said softly. "You're Ranger." Thomas nodded. "Maybe, but it's ours." The helicopter lifted off, wind roaring through the clearing as it vanished into the sky. Thomas looked at Ranger, who was trembling, but this time not from pain, from release. He was free. They returned to the boat in silence. The dog laid his head on Thomas's lap and, for the first time, closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because he was finally at last able to obtain a name. A week had gone by since the altercation on the cliff. The ocean was calm once more, the sky was clear and soft with spring sunlight, and a modest cabin by the bay on the edge of a quiet Florida coastal town had become something it hadn't been in a long time. A home. Ranger lay sprawled on the porch with his head resting on his paws and his eyes half closed. A warm breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine, and his body had started to fill out again, stronger and more relaxed. The wounds on his legs were healing, but more than that, the tightness in his eyes had vanished, the war behind his eyes had quieted, and Thomas emerged from the cabin with a bowl of grilled chicken and rice. "You better be hungry, because that's the good stuff," stretched long and slow and trotted over without hesitation or fear. He ate calmly and swept his tail lazily behind him. When he was done, he sat next to Thomas and watched the waves roll gently onto the shore. Thomas took a deep breath. He still didn't know who the men in the helicopter actually worked for. He hadn't heard anything since that day. Perhaps they had moved on or were still watching, but the silence didn't feel threatening. Rather, it felt like acceptance. "Looks like they gave up," he said. Guess they figured you were already home. Ranger gently blinked his later that afternoon, when they arrived in town, the owner of the tiny pet supply store on Main Street. Linda greeted them with a smile and lowered herself to eye level. You must be a ranger, she said. You've become quite the legend around here. She offered up a Trotter leather collar with a single word stamped in gold across the front. Ranger Thomas took it with quiet reverence and knelt to fasten it gently around the dog's neck. There, he added, sniffing her hand and giving it a courteous tail wag. The next stop was the beach, not the open sea, where he had almost drowned, but a quiet sandy stretch with shallow waves and children's laughter in the air. The ranger stepped cautiously onto the sand, and the sounds of the ocean no longer made him flinch. Thomas threw a ball gently down the shore, and the ranger hesitated before chasing it. It wasn't swift or elegant, but it was free when he returned, tongue lingering. Now that the sun was setting, they went home, and the light turned golden, and the cabin glowed in its soft, sturdy way. Sometimes the most powerful things don't need to be said. Not all rescues begin with a plan. Not all heroes wear badges, and not all broken things stay broken. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thomas sat next to the ranger, who was curled up at the foot of the porch, with his arm resting on the dog's back. They remained there for a long time without saying anything. Teaches us that there is always a way, no matter how lost we feel.